a phenomenon of extreme degradation, for example, having violent outcomes such as civil wars or permanent discrimination, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. We have many instances of that. And or they can create a process, a phenomenon of mild degradation, so non-violent outcomes, such as political stalemate, the corrosion of the constitutional structure, and so on. So in these contexts, constitutional design plays a crucial role in to face these challenges and the processes of constitutional degradation. My main point in the paper is that if, generally speaking, constitutional degradation comes from within, in divided societies, this goes even further with constitutional degradation coming by design. And to explain this point, I selected the Bosnian showcase, so Bosnia and Herzegovina as a case study. And I selected Bosnia because it's a classic example of a divided society having a deep internal fragmentation along ethno-cultural lines. There are three main ethnic groups: the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Croats, and the biggest group of the Bosniaks, so the Muslim population. And in 1992, there was, in the overall process of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, there was a dramatic civil war among these three groups, and it was followed by a process of constitutional design to accommodate such ethnocultural diversities, and which culminated in the conclusion of the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995. And in my opinion, it is a perfect exemplification of constitutional degradation caused by constitutional design, as many of the challenges that Bosnia is facing are due to the model of constitutional design that was introduced by Dayton. Because the constitutional structure is quite complex and quite diverse, and the process of constitutional degradation took place in many forms. For example, there is the so-called, the well-known Sejdić-Finci case law of the Strasbourg Court, condemning Bosnia for the non-representation, for the lack of institutional representation of national minorities from the presidency and the second chamber of the central level. Also, Dayton has given the ethnocultural groups a strong veto power to defend their interests, and this has caused the political stalemating in political institutions at the central level, hindering the process of constitutional amendments and constitutional reforms. And I decided to focus on the judiciary as a vulnerable area subject to constitutional degradation, because the rule of law has been extremely degraded in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the judicial system in Bosnia and Herzegovina is highly decentralized, as it is a competence of the entities to organize the judiciary, so not at the central level, but at the subnational level. And the two entities in which Bosnia is divided are quite different. The one, it is a federation divided into 10 cantons, so highly decentralized, while the other is a unitary republic. So they're extremely different, and also the organization of the judiciary reflects this aspect. So there is a high level of complexity and a great lack of coordination among levels, and the judicial independence of the judges at all levels is still not fully guaranteed. And many attempts in strengthening the rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina concerning the judiciary has been made by the European Union, by the Venice Commission. But the main point remains that constitutional reforms to address these issues are lost in the political institutions, are held hostage by the political parties and their veto powers. So it is all in standby. So this leads me to my final points, which are a sort of confirmation that in countries like Bosnia, characterized by a high level of internal diversity, the process of constitutional design itself planted the seeds for potential constitutional degradation. So for this process of degradation. And in Bosnia in particular, the complex constitutional structure and architecture designed by the Dayton peace agreements aggravates significantly the capacity of the system to properly address and properly uphold the rule of law. So, as I said at the beginning, in countries like Bosnia, so in divided societies, constitutional degradation comes by design and not only, or rather than from within the constitutional structure. And it is finally a sort of vicious circle, because to address the process of constitutional degradation, it would be necessary to amend the constitution or adopt reforms that the constitutional design model adopted hinders significantly. As, for example, in Bosnia, it is impossible to find the necessary consensus to pass these amendments and reforms. So I think that I was within the limits of time, and this is the main ideas of my paper, and I hope to have a useful discussion about it. Thank you.
Perfect, Lydia. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your paper and the connection between constitutional degradation and violent society. I think that then we can come back to this relationship. And now the floor, and thank you also because you respected 10 minutes in a perfect way. So my compliment. The second paper that we want to present is the paper elaborated by Giacomo Salvadori. Tiago is there? Yes, perfect.
Yes, Professor.
Tiago is a PhD student in comparative law at the University of Campania, Ponticelli, and he was graduated at the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. And this paper is related to the Brazilian case that is probably one of the most interesting cases of constitutional degradation, in my opinion. So, Mr. Bucal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organization of the event for the opportunity to be here. I'm very honored to be here this afternoon, and also happy to meet again Professor Petrillo, which is also a big reference for me in my thesis that I'm developing in the field of intangible cultural heritage. Well, I am going to focus precisely on the phenomena of constitutional degradation in Brazil and the protection of cultural rights. Brazilian constitutional democracy has been going through a deep political crisis, at least since 2013. The political institutional processes triggered the tricycle impeachment of the former President Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and the rise of reactionary populism led by the election of the current President Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. Amid these processes, the economic retraction and the increasing social problems arising from it have put the country in a context of multiple crises in which the political crisis is only one dimension. Cultural rights, recognized by the 1988 Federal Constitution, are placed at the core of this movement and are one of the fields to which the democratic and constitutional degradation process become more evident, especially in what concerns the constitutional policies for culture. The 1988 Brazilian Constitution has produced a wide and detailed process of cultural rights constitutionalization, historically marked by an underdevelopment in both theoretical and normative fields. Cultural rights have since then gained relevance from the political point of view and legal projection as fundamental rights. Triggered by the new social movements that have organized in Brazilian public sphere since the 70s, particularly by the process of politicization of culture, in which the indigenous peoples have had an important role, the recognition of cultural rights is actually a historic innovation for Brazilian constitutionalism. Indeed, it is possible to list at least two modus operandi by which the constitutional degradation has occurred in Brazil, particularly in what it comes to cultural rights. First, through constitutional amendment, and second, through institutional deregulation, which subvert the literal meaning of the constitutional text and end up being obstacles for the effectiveness of cultural rights. The first modus finds reference in the Constitutional Amendment number 95, enacted in 2016, known as the Constitutional Amendment of Public Spending Ceiling, that instituted a new tax regime. Also known as the Amendment of the End of the World or Death Amendment, it limits the growth of public spending for the three branches of power for the next 20 years, what concretely implies on the impossibility of new public investment in social policies, weakening social protection, cultural rights, and challenging fundamental rights. The second modus concerns the extinction of organs that are essential for turning effective cultural rights, as it is the case of the former Ministry of Culture, extinguished in one of the first administrative acts of the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, in 2019. It is an act of deregulation insofar as it destabilizes the operability of state cultural policies inscribed in the constitutional text. In this regard, it is evident that these actions and/or omissions undermine the social, legal, and political pact enacted by the 1988 Constitution, insofar as they hinder or hamper the effectiveness of fundamental rights, especially cultural rights, a category often not taken seriously by conservative and reactionary governments that tend to reduce it into moral or religious discussions. Indeed, it can be stated that these new political methodologies, which constitute the nucleus of constitutional degradation of cultural rights, are evident examples of symbolic constitutionalization and matter of fact or factual deconstitutionalization, as highlights Marcelo Neves, a Brazilian law scholar. In this regard, Marcelo Neves defines that the symbolic constitutionalization occurs when the symbolic function of the constitution norm is hypertrophied in detriment of the instrumental function, resulting in direct damage to the core of the constitutional subsystem, especially with regard to fundamental rights. Therefore, it can be said that the Constitutional Amendment number 95 produces directly and indirectly the symbolization of fundamental rights and especially cultural rights. This is because although every constitutional text has a symbolic dimension, in this particular case, it is evident that the symbolism takes a hypertrophied dynamic, as the constitutional amendment disrupts the centrality of the process of formulating and effectivating public policies in order to make technical legal instrumentality difficult, weakening the applicability of fundamental rights. Likewise, Marcelo Neves also points to the matter of fact or factual deconstitutionalization, which is the distortion of the constitutional text in the process, during the process of effectiveness, without basis on a generalizable normative criteria, which is without making a change in the Constitution. Thus, the meaning of the Constitution is distorted so that its implementation does not alter the status quo. Therefore, matter-of-fact or factual deconstitutionalization means that delegalization, due to the fragility of the legal code in its inability to congruently generalize, and the lack of consistent autonomy and identity of a sphere of legality. That is, the constitutional text is neglected by power structures. In this context, the political institutional deinstitutionalization imposes a distortion of the constitutional text during its application. And so, although cultural rights continue to be established in the Constitution, as states the Articles 215 and 216, institutional deregulation distorts its meaning, imposing an undeclared restriction on its implementation. It is in this sense that constitutional degradation is positioned as a paradigm of current Brazilian constitutional law, particularly with regard to cultural rights. Indeed, in addition to the constitutional mutation, which includes the factual deconstitutionalization and the symbolic constitutionalization, it is important to emphasize that constitutional degradation effectively produces a constitutional mutilation operated by ordinary politics. So in some conclusion remarks, the process of constitutional degradation in Brazil is an unprecedented fact precisely because this constitutional mutilation is being carried out by a type of political regime unprecedented since the redemocratization of the country in 1985, and is clearly characterized by a reactionary populism with an ultra-neoliberal economic agenda. The rise of this regime was only possible due to the gradual degradation of the political environment of Brazilian democracy and its institutions, which occurred since 2013, has deepened in 2016 with the impeachment of the former President Dilma Rousseff, and consummated with the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. Indeed, periods of political institutional crisis directly weaken the guarantee of fundamental rights, especially those rights that even in times of political stability already had fragile guarantees. Cultural rights are a clear example of this weakness, mainly to the level of underdevelopment in the scope of legal guarantees. In this context, it is only by affirming the Constitution and its legal force and all institutions, organs, public spaces, spaces of power, education institutions, and especially cultural institutions, that it will be possible to reverse the current process of constitutional degradation. Thank you so much.
Political and administrative acts. And effectively, I think that the degradation of cultural rights can be a clear proof of constitutional degradation. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much. And now we have our Valentina Carlino. She is a researcher in comparative public law at the University of Siena. So you play at home, we can say. With her, we move to the African context, and especially the case of Benin. So please, Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everybody. Since I play at home, I feel the responsibility. Well, as the professor said, I am going to talk about Benin. In fact, no geographical area is immune from the processes of constitutional degradation that we are discussing in this workshop. Nevertheless, scholars generally concentrate mainly on the weaknesses of the democratic guarantees characterizing countries of stable and consolidating democracy tradition. Indeed, it could be more complicated to discuss about the recession of democracy in a context in which this latter is not fully achieved. It seems that this is precisely the reason why few studies focus on the degeneration of the African democracies, following a sort of preconception on the continent, that of the so-called impossible democracy. Nevertheless, the African continent is part of the global trend of democratic backsliding. The situation of the area is so heterogeneous that it would be impossible and risky to generally discuss about it, not considering the significant variations within the territory. Nevertheless, generally speaking, it seems pretty evident that the African constitutionalism is going through serious difficulties, thus putting into question the achievement, if partial, of the so-called second transition of the African democracy. In this context, Benin is the first country of the sub-Saharan Africa in terms of democratic decline, as also Freedom House indicates. Indeed, until very recently, Benin has been globally recognized as one of the African best hopes and normally indicated as one of the proud democratic examples of the continent. The Beninese constitutional design, entrenched in the 1990 constitution, has proved to be very successful. It is also worth highlighting that if we can observe a certain stability in the democracy in the African area, Benin witnessed an improvement of democracy, which is pretty rare for the area. In fact, not only the country has always granted a changeover of powers, but also the various monitoring bodies have effectively been able to constrain the executive power, thus permitting to maintain the democratic framework. One could then be surprised in discovering this sudden fall of the democracy in the country that is rapidly declining since the election of Patrice Talon as President of the Republic in 2016. The country was generally indicated as the African democratic exception, and now it's being transformed in a case study for the undemocratic third of the continent. The major events are pretty recent. In fact, Freedom House downgraded the country to partially free in 2020. The first turning point has been the election of the new members of the Constitutional Court occurred in June 2018. The former court maintained very tense relations with President Talon, condemning the government more than once for the non-respect or the disregard of the Constitution. In particular, the judges censored the statute on the withdrawal of the right to strike for magistrates and some public workers, which was one of the major reforms of the Talon presidency concerning the public administration. It could be also useful, even very briefly, to add that the Beninese Constitutional Court has always been very active, to the point that it has been accused of doing too much more than once. So it is easy to understand why it was so important for President Talon when the new court has been appointed. President Talon exercised a lot of pressure on the parliament in which he held a majority, and in fact, when the new 7 members of the court were appointed, it has not been too surprising to discover that they were all near to the president. Moreover, Joseph Giacomo has been elected as president of the court and is very near to Talon. He used to be his lawyer. In that way, after taking, we could say, the court, Talon would initiate that institutional convergence that he explicitly stated to wait for implementing a set of reforms. Significantly, a few days after the renewal of the Constitutional Court, this last ruled again on the withdrawal of the right to strike for the public employees, completely overturning the previous sentence of the court and thus endorsing the prohibition introduced by Talon, which was considered by the chief of state as necessary to ease free market reforms. In the same month of June in 2018, the Constitutional Court also adjudicated in favor of a legislative novelty strongly supported by Talon and implemented by the president of the Constitutional Court himself, so Giacomo, when he was Minister of Justice until the month before this sentence. I am referring to the creation of the so-called CRIET, which is a special court to prosecute terrorism and economic crimes in first and last instance. One of the first cases brought before the special court has been the so-called Giacomo affair. The special judges prosecuted the political opponent of Talon in absentia for drug possession, sentencing him to 20 years in prison with no possibility to appeal, after that the ordinary tribunal had already prosecuted and finally released Giacomo for lack of evidence. The conviction has also been condemned by the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which with the occasion also criticized the very existence of the special court. But the Constitutional Court rejected all the charges of non-compliance with international obligations, substantially ignoring the suggestions of the Arusha Court, and then validating the special judge that in the months following sentenced to prison many people belonging to the opposition, especially when the presidential election of April 2021 came. In this context, it is essential to highlight that President Talon tried to amend the constitution more than once. The revision of the constitution in the aim of assuring the incumbents with the possibility of renewing the mandate more than 2 times, so 3 times or more, that extending the period in power is very common within the African countries. Nevertheless, what is typical is that in Benin, the pluralistic political framework and the activism of the civil society has been able to stop that revision for a long time. In fact, when Talon tried in 2016 and again in 2017 to amend the constitution, it failed because he couldn't get the approval of the National Assembly that he needed for such a reform. He understood then that he needed to gain more loyals in the parliament, and then he started to revise the electoral framework with the intent of assuring the majority in the legislative election of April 2019. Well, the list of legal gambits employed by Talon and these loyalists to normalize the political exclusion is long and it's intricate. Little by little, he dismantled the political pluralism, permitting de facto abandon of the opposition parties. In September 2018, the National Assembly adopted a restrictive new electoral code and revised the charter of the political parties. The novelties had immediately been strongly criticized by the opposition, accusing the majority to have solely aimed to exclude them from the electoral competition and thus favoring the incumbent president. Indeed, among the others, the new code has fixed the threshold for the allocation of the parliamentary seats to the 10% of the vote, and it has also significantly increased the bail that the electoral list must pay to be admitted to the electoral competition, bringing it from around 12,000 euros to around 300,000 euros as for the presidential election, and from 10,000 euros to 380,000 euros. So it's really huge. And we also must consider that a new law on the public financing of political parties has been implemented, thus changing the rules for sharing the money among the parties. We should also consider that the Constitutional Court unilaterally introduced an obligation to produce a certificate of conformity to the new rules of the Charter to be released by the Minister of the Interior. And this document was not provided for any legislative test. It has been totally created by the Constitutional Court and then immediately welcomed by the Electoral Commission, which, even if formally independent, is very loyal to the president. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to the conclusions because there would be many to say. The fact is that Talon is really changed the soul of the country, which used to be democratic, and it's changing this form little by little with formal, with reforms that formally are legitimate or could be considered legitimate. In the end, I would just like to add that since the African Court is repeatedly adjudicating against the anti-democratic action taken in Benin, the solution decided by the Beninese government was to eliminate the possibility for citizens and non-government organizations to directly address to the African Kurd. So that was the solution found. I will try to show, so Benin perfectly fits with this definition, and I think that we should also look at this phenomenon within the African country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Interesting also if we connect your presentation with the presentation elaborated by Lydia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I think that shows the role of judiciary power for or against constitutional degradation. So we will come back on this point. Now the floor is Mr. Ali Shirvani. He's a researcher at the Middle East Institute in Xi'an. Is there? Ali? Can you hear me? Are you connected? Or we come back to you later? We come back to you later. Perfect. Perfect. So the next paper presented is by Elis Garuja. Elis, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Perfect. Ali. Ali. Perfect. So sorry, Elis, we come back to Ali.
Okay.
Ali, now you can hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So Ali Shirvani is graduated in the University of Isfahan. Isfahan is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, in my opinion. I had the opportunity to visit
Great.
18 years ago, and I love it. Ali we present a paper on the degradation of democracy via Islamic Sharia. So it's another point of view. Please, Ali, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. Is my voice okay? Can you hear me?
Still so, but if you go, I can confirm it. We can hear or not.
Hello? It is okay now? Is it okay? Shall I go on?
The audio is not very good for us, but I don't know for our colleagues that are connected. But you can go.
Okay, I start. Yeah, in my paper, I'm going to discuss the way of degradation through Islamic Sharia. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Everything is fine? Hello? Okay. Uh, as you may know, some constitutions use the Islamic Sharia as the source of law and source of creating laws or establishing modern laws, and then they interpret all the active law through the legislator by the Islamic Sharia. The way that they are going to use to degrade the democracy in these constitutions that use the Islamic Sharia as the source of all laws is that they're going to put every constitutional institution or every democratic institution that normally used in the constitutions, and then put a final term that these institutions, these laws, are should be adoptable to the Islamic Sharia. First, I should mention that Islamic Sharia or the Sharia or Islamic criteria are the principles of Islam that are not changed from the beginning. And the way to, the instrument or the way to interpret them called fiqh or jurisprudence in English. And the person who does that, or the Islamic legal expert called faqih. So, for example, as we have constitutional courts in other constitutions, that is a central institution to see the constitutionality of laws. We have the Guardian Council or the Council of Ulama in Islamic Sharia constitution or in constitution that use Islamic law. They are similar to each other, or they are the same in the face, but substantively or in deep size, they are not similar. If I want to continue with an example, for example, in constitutions like Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we have the institution called Guardian Council. It has 12 members, like a constitutional court, but for appointing these members, there are several terms that has to be implemented. Like the important one, that women cannot be the judges, or women cannot be the member of the Guardian Council. This term is very important because when the Constitution provides the terms of the membership, it doesn't mention to that. The other example is the definition of the people in such constitutions. In constitution that use the Islamic law, in the preamble or in the first articles, they say or they provide that all the people are equal to the law. But in the time of interpretation, the people or the definition of the people in the Constitution differs from the people who believe in God or who are the Muslims or who are not Muslims. And then we go on to be a judge or to be a member of a Guardian Council or a constitutional court. For example, those people who are women cannot be the member, or those people who are not Muslims, they cannot be the member. And in this way, they degraded the constitutional, the democracy and its value. The other one is that the other way, or the other thing that I want to mention, that the way that a legislator act in these countries or in this constitution is that they promulgate the law through a process that we all know, that they discuss it publicly and then they act it and then they publish it for all the people. But at the time of interpretation, they use fiqh or the Islamic legal expert, they use their method, which is not the same as the legislature to see the adaptability or to see the constitutionality. For example, a faqih idea or theory is not published for all the people, and it's not this idea is not available or accessible for all the legal experts who wants to read it or to discuss it or to challenge these ideas. So in conclusion, if I want to finish this topic here, the Islamic Sharia is a way of constitutionalism that we can call it dark side of the constitutionalism that use a term that changed all the concepts and definitions of normal constitutional topics to what is against the rule of law. And the nature of the Islamic constitutionalism here in my idea is totally different with the democratic or secular constitutionalism. Sorry for my maybe bad presentation. That's okay.
We tried to follow you, was not very good for the audio, so we hope to read soon your paper, because I think that the topic that you decide to study can be very interesting for this for the topic of constitutional degradation. Now, so thank you very much. And we remain connected because at the end we try to have a debate through with our colleague. So now is the moment of Elis Garunja.
Yes.
I don't know if Garunja is the correct pronunciation of your surname.
Garunya.
Garunja, right.
Yeah.
Elis, we cannot see you. I don't know.
Okay.
If you can start the video in this way.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So, she is a lawyer in Albania, and she finished her PhD in Pavia in public and comparative administrative law, and her paper is about the Albanian case. Please,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here and to participate in this conference workshop altogether about related on cases about improvement of constitution in our country. First of all, I have to make a fast, very important introduction. In 2016, Albanian constitution had different changes related to the most important part of the judiciary system. For the first time in Albania, we had a big consensus among all the parties, left and right, about this importance of this judiciary system reform. So in 2016, with 140 votes of 140 MPs, we have important reform of constitution. Why it was so important for us? Because the perception of the public was focused on judiciary system, and the fact that their perception was that the phenomena of corruption in the judiciary system was very high. The judiciary was affected by or influenced by external actors. At the same time, this power was not transparent, was ineffective and inapplicable with judicial decisions. So according to a survey about corruption in Albania, perception and experiences, the Research Institute on Development Alternatives found that Albanians believe that courts were more influenced by money interests, by commercial ties, personal connections with judges, and political considerations. Because of that, to increase the confidence in institutions of justice, Albanian politicals undertake a series of constitutional changes that aimed to a radical reform of the judicial system in Albania, which is a unique one in its kind, as a guarantor of independence of constitutional institutions, strengthening the healthy part and fulfilling one of the obligations for the European integration of Albania, which is important, as one of the most important part of this reform was the control or vetting, which is the exclusion from judicial system of individuals or persons who do not meet one of the three constitutional criteria, which was wealth, moral integrity, and professionalisms, omitting other important aspects like the new entrance in the system, the career system, or the quality improvement of judicial decisions, transparency, independence, and professionalism. Vetting in itself is only a control of magistrates. It's not a reform of justice, but it's only constituted. It's an important phase of the reform. Which is the most important part is the changing of all important institutions of justice. So after 3 years of important reforms, we face with the problem that all the institutions were not established at all or definitely. They have still now vacations or gaps or a lot of vacancies in their membership or in their bodies. We had more than 31,000 of cases which need to be proceeded from the Supreme Court. At the same time, we have more than 150 magistrates out of judicial system. But according to all the data of different studies, we achieve even more good improvements. For example, till now, the justice reform achieved the fact that we had selected 6 members of constitutional court, which means that we have new institutions of judiciary system. We have judicial appointment council, which is selected, the High Inspector of Justice, which is a new institution of justice according to the new reform of justice. The High Judicial Council selected 3 senior judges and continue to go through the selection of 12 senior judges for the High Court. At the same time, the High Council of Prosecution selected the General Prosecutor and other 13 members of the Court of Anti-Corruption and Organized Crime in Albania. The National Bureau of Investigation was set up in 2020 and has its own director. At the same time, our Constitutional Court, which remained without any activity for more than 4 years, now this last year has its own quorum of 7 members, and it starts its activity after all this period of pause. The High Court, even with 3 members, continues going through processes, and during this period finished more than 2,100 cases. The High Inspector of Justice reviewed more than 180 complaints against judges and prosecutors. But at the same time, we shows the fact shows that still the number of of complaints and processes against corruption and organized crime are very few. The few number of cases are gone through the new institutions of judiciary reform. For example, only 5 prison sentences for corruption are issued by the first instance court, according and with a maximum of 3 years to the minimum of 6 months of imprisonment, which means that even the charges for the corruption crimes are these crimes with the level of imprisonment years very low. At the same time, we faced with a very high number of denunciations, around 271 persons risk from these denunciations, but till now we have only 42 of them which are cases based through the trial or court processes. We have 162 files for organized crime, and only 16 of them goes through trials. The most important things is that according to the period of establishment of this reform, till now passed through 5 years. The fact is that the perception of public was very high. They trust a lot on this reform, but the problem is that still now they are very disappointed. Maybe because they didn't see yet any magistrate or a prosecutor go to jail or go under a trial, or we didn't have now any important name from a high level of administration go to jail or being conducted for their crimes or corruption. So according to the perception given from different studies of social civil society, still people are not so convinced about the good result of this reform, but we are here. In Albania, there are a lot of denunciations. So this reform is under progress and process. So maybe we should give more chances and push more through the encouragement of institutions to do all the best with their responsibility. Let's see how this reform will go through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you. And now we have Ferdinando La Placa. He's connected, yes, he's connected. About this paper is a comparative overview of constitutional degradation, and dedicates this paper especially to 4 important cases: the Russian case, the Poland, Hungary, and Turkey case. Ferdinand, please take the floor. No, we cannot hear you. Sorry. Frankie.
Se avete il suo microfono
Sì, sì.
è attivato.
Sì.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now, yes. No. Now, no. It's a sort of joke, but it's very common. Try again. Try to remove the headphone. Try to remove. Okay. Try to speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So, okay, in my brief speech, I hope to not exceed the time limit. I'll try to examine the process of constitutional degradation and see which are the instruments they are usually deployed, and see some peculiar cases, as the professor already mentioned, and make at the end some final remarks. Starting, we have to say that the constitutional degradation is a slow but gradual decay in the features and structure of contemporary democracy. Differently from constitutional collapse or a coup, is not an overnight phenomenon, but it takes a much longer time. In that case, the instrument used are constitutional and legal one, so within the framework of democracy, and preserving the formal facade of a democratic and of democracy, the state undergoes a partial erosion of the values and norms which are considered to be fundamental of the constitutional democracy. And since there is this it's difficult to understand when this process started.
Kërkojnë ndjesë sepse nuk kanë pika përpara ndo që ishte. Si kanë? Mirë, dashur, mirë.
When
someone that
when this process
didn't stop the microphone, didn't close the microphone. I don't know if Evis can close the microphone, please. Okay, please, Ferdinand.
2020, jo. Të vit, 2020-2021, jo. Për drejtsinë e ke fjalë.
With the microphone open. Okay, we close it. Please, Ferdinand.
Okay. So since it's difficult to understand the precise moment when this process begins, as Ginsburg say, like the proverbial boiling frog, a democratic society in the midst of erosion might not realize its predicament until matters are already beyond redress. So it's important to notice that the constitutional degradation is not an external phenomenon, but is an internal phenomenon of democracy. And the main actor who light the fuse to this process are the political parties, and in particular, I would say, populist parties and populist leaders. Because with their constitutional counter narrative that use and manipulate the principle and the values of the constitutional democracy, manipulating them, giving a resemblance of legitimacy to their political agenda, to their political program, they endorse a peculiar idea of democracy, a pure democracy, or as Orban said, an illiberal democracy that without the constraint of constitutional democracy could better face the challenges of a globalized and competitive society. But what scares more about populism is the counterfactual notion of people that is considered to be as an homogeneous community which describes itself as opposed to an alleged others, and all the people who are not included in the definition of the people are not considered as proper part of the community, of the society. So they refuse the pluralism inside the society, and they also retain to be the only and true interpreter and representative of the people. So that in that case, the people trying to interpret the will of the people are not and that try to hinder, obstacle their political action are considered as enemy of the people. In that case, if the populist ideas spread among the society, and if they manage to win the election also, it means that a part of the society will share their view. And so the constitutional degradation will not only occur, but the people will be more prone to accepting and legitimizing it. But which are the instruments that they usually use, since they could be considered like the mechanic who start this process? These instruments are legal and constitutional one, as I said at the beginning, and they are usually discrete reform that, if used singularly, they could be consistent with the democratic scope. But if summed up together, they could represent a risk for the democracy. The main instruments are four. The first one is a constitutional amendment or constitutional replacement. In that case, there is, following the procedure provided by the Constitution, the alteration of the constitutional text. Usually, this can be, of course, consistent with the democracy, since an update or a renewal of the Constitution could be highly justifiable. In the second case, in the second instrument, is the alteration of the electoral competition. Usually the electoral rules are fixed and accepted by all the political parties in order to guarantee a fair election. But if populist leaders are in power, they usually tend to preserve and maintain the power. And if they modify and alter the electoral rules, it's obvious that the competition will not be fair anymore. In that case, with the excuse of the giving more stability to the system, so avoiding an hung parliament, they, or maybe to avoid electoral fraud, they could introduce some new electoral system, or maybe making more complex procedure to cast the vote of the people. The third instrument could be the weakening of check and balance system. The constitutional amendment is not always an available solution, since you need to reach high majority, and so the other instrument can be used, and in that case the main instrument is weakening and capturing the parliament. But in that case, usually if you have the government, you also have the majority of the parliament, and capturing the independent bodies who are set to guard the constitution, in that case the judiciary. And if you cannot do it through the constitutional amendment, you usually intervene in the rule of regarding the inner functioning of these bodies. At the end, we have the reduction of fundamental rights and freedom, and in this case, the reason used, ambiguous reason of public security or morality that can restrict the freedom of opinion, of speech, and also the independence of the media. In that case, for instance, journalists can be arrested because they spread false information, or also the NGOs could be shut down for alleged terrorist reason. To give some examples, in Hungary, for instance, Hungary is second to none as constitutional amendment. When Orban won the election in 2010, he immediately introduced some constitutional amendment to remove the obstacle that could hinder his modification of the constitution. Indeed, in 2011, he replaced the old constitution with a new one in 2011, and during the following years, he introduced new amendment to adapt the constitution to his political project. In Poland, the government didn't reach the majority, the sufficient majority to modify the constitution, and so the government decided to capture the judiciary, not only the constitutional court intervening in the inner functioning of it, but also the Supreme Court, the National Council of the Judiciary, and also the procedure regarding the appointment of the ordinary judges. In Turkey, after the failed coup, the Erdogan promote his constitutional reforms, which transform the Turkey in a presidential state, and gave him more decree power, which in an emergency state, as it was, this power could be deployed without the control of the Constitutional Court, and could intervene in every subject, also reducing the fundamental rights. And after the constitutional coup, a lot of journalists and academics were imprisoned, and also all the media which were not aligned with Erdogan political view were shut down. In Russia, the new constitutional reform of 2020 gave Putin the possibility to stay in power until the 2036. And so if we join it with the fact that it's not uncommon in Russia to imprison also the political oppositors, it's obvious that Putin has, controlling also the media, the possibility to govern without alternatives. So to conclude, we see that in all these cases, the populist leader managed to, respecting the procedure provided by the Constitution and the law, modify all the state and the institution. The element that, like the Britain Constitution on its rigidity, which were considered to be bastions of democracy, proved to be only simple fence before this populist attacked. But of course, the blame is not only on the Constitution, since we need someone who wants to start this process, and in this case, it's of course the populist leader. To face populism, it's of course the burden of the political parties, which need to demonstrate that the democratic solution are better solution than undemocratic one, but is as a burden of political parties. As for the constitutional side, it's the constitution need to better protect themselves, not only introducing some system that will make their modification more complex, maybe with the intervention of other political bodies or like the Constitutional Court, but also we need to protect better the judiciary and all the bodies and independent institutions we are put to guard the Constitution. Because if constitutional defense falls, all the system will follow, even without the slightest constitutional change. Thank you.
This part of view of the topic. And now we give the floor to Andrea Cristina Robles-Subsidies. She's a researcher in constitutional law, University of Bogotá in Colombia, and she presented the paper trying to connect the role of rating international agencies and the constitutional degradation. I think that it would be interesting also for us, this kind of relationship. Please, Andrea Cristina.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thank you. I'm also from University of Siena. I'm studying my PhD there, and I will be there in person, but I'm now working from Bogota. Well, I think that I am the only one of this panel that tried to connect this political and constitutional phenomenon with the economic effect. And it makes me a few nervous because is in appearance is a technical issue, it's a very technocracy issue, but I think that we must to focus more on this topic. Well, my paper is related to the relationship between domestic and international legal order, and it borns when or I would like to do a previous reflection. I think that everybody remembers the issue that the last year happened with Poland and Hungary in the European relating the European Union funds, and the block that these two countries make with the 2 trillions funds, financial aid that the European Union want to give to the countries, because they argue that this financial aid cannot be linked with the rule of law principle and the democratic principles. And it makes me think about what is the cost, or how much cost to those populist government to be like that, to a part of the democracy's principle, how much it's cost in the financial order. And to do that, I start review the rating gave by the big threes to some countries. I checked the rating that nowadays have Singapore, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Chile, and I found that the most of these cases that everybody knows as examples of illiberal democracies, they have a high and upper median grade gave by these agencies. So if we just look this rating, we can conclude that in appearance it doesn't exist a link between the political choices and the economics effect of the sovereignty debt. Well, my paper to affront this problem, I divide and I study this problem in 3 parts. The first one, I try to study is, does exist evidence about any historical democracy advantage in the qualifications doing by the big threes, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. And in this part of my research, I looking for the ranking of some states while they were dictatorship. And I'm looking for example, the studies of credit ratings of Argentina. And I also studies all the debt that was taken by dictatorship. And I also look if this the historical rating gave to Chile. In this part, I want to say something because I found that Chile, historical, since it was a dictatorship, has a good qualification of, but last year when Chile started with this constitution, with this movement to create a new constitution, the qualification of Chile has down, and for this year, Chile got a work qualification. Well, the second part of my research is about what happened right now. What happened right now with the sample cases of illiberal democracies. As I told you, Singapore, China, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Poland, for this year, they got a good qualification, most of them. And my last part of the study is about the reforms, the amendment of the regulation of these agencies that happens after the financial crisis of 2008 and 2010. Well, how many minutes I left? Okay. Why it is important to study this regulation? Because we talk about a private independent company that looking for a profit. They are a profit company, but they do a public function. Actually, they are profit company, but the rate of sovereign debt, they are public. I mean, they publish this rating for free, and this rating has a political role. The point of my paper is, in fact, if this rating has a political role, why is not so clear that in the methodology of these ratings they analyze the political and institutional issue of these countries. Nowadays, when we study the methodology, is still not clear what is the importance of the institution and the degradation in the rankings, in the ratings. So I focus on how the amendment in the European regulation happened in 2011 and 2013 reinforce the accountability and the transparency of the rating agencies in this topic, in the methodology. And I found that the same issue happened in US when in July of 2010, the regulation of this agency was amendment 2, but today with the new qualification that we received for this year, I haven't found any implication of this new regulation to the ranking that received the traditional illiberal democracies. So it is like the big conclusion of my paper support on the of the data that I gave from the last rankings. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your consideration. We will come back at the end of our presentation now. It's the time of Giacomo Salvadori. Giacomo, I hope that you are connected. Giacomo is a lawyer. Yes, I need so. Yes, perfect. And we decided to dedicate this paper to Italian and Spanish case. So, Giacomo Salvadori, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor. I'm honored to take part in this assembly. I hear echo. Do you listen me well? Okay. My paper deals with the subject of this workshop, the constitutional degradation under the lens of freedom of expression, examining some recent judicial cases in Italy and Spain. These are two member states of the European Union which, after the Second World War, and with particular intensity during the 1970s and 80s, faced the explosion of armed struggle carried out by terrorist organizations through the approval of particularly strict criminal legislation. Emblematic of this historical period are the Italian Brigate Rosse, BR, and the Basque Euskaditas Katasuna, ETA, organization with different objectives but united by subversive aims. Both were born within the students and workers movement, from which they drew a common Marxist-Leninist matrix to then join the armed struggle against state institutions. The Basque case is peculiar because the transition to clandestinity preceded the end of the Franco dictatorship by about 20 years, but the frontal conflict with the state also continued in the democratic regime, where the independence demands found parliamentary representation. It should not be forgotten that the terrorist phenomenon was so present during the transition process that the Constitution itself brings the signs of it, explicitly mentioning in Article 55 the possibility of suspending constitutional guarantees of pre-trial detention, inviolability of the home, and secrecy of correspondence para personas determinadas en relación con las investigaciones correspondientes a la actuación de bandas armadas o elementos terroristas. Keeping in mind the aspects of divergence between the two terrorist experiences, among others, historical context and institutional regime of origin, objectives pursued, territorial routing, and popular representativeness, the premise is useful to observe how the state repressive action, coordinated in every articulation, made it possible to overcome a very turbulent historical period, contributing to the consolidation of a delicate stability for two young democratic systems. This was possible, among the many reasons, by a substantial and firm coincidence of intentions that drove the uniform action of all the public powers involved in the fight against terrorism. The parallelism between the two countries has become topical again in recent times as a result of some trials in Turin and Madrid, which lead to an important question. Is there a risk that the panoply of repressive instruments, legacy of the fight against old and new terrorism, will be used for the sole purpose of criminalizing certain forms of dissent? A similar trend can be found where the criminal protection appears manifestly disproportionate compared to the value expressed by certain non-violent behaviors, which, far from being included in the large framework of instigation offenses, remind commentators of the dark traits of the crime of opinion. As is well known, the Italian Constitutional Court since the 1970s has advanced a constitutionally oriented interpretation of some crimes of opinion provided by the fascist criminal code, considering necessary a concrete suitability of the manifestation of thought to solicit the commission of criminal acts. It's only the existence of a danger to the protected legal goods that legitimates the compatibility between the crimes of instigation and the Article 21 of the Constitution. However, this delicate balance requires a meticulous assessment by the judicial authority, having to reject the idea that the motivation can be limited to quick references to the characteristics of offensiveness of the context in which the statements are expressed, or even worse, to the ideological proximity of the alleged moral author person responsible for violent action in the past. In the recent times in Italy, the Italian Public Prosecutor Office has constantly resorted to criminal prosecution also in respect of secondary facts. I'm sorry. I'm reading my Canovaccio, but I lost. Okay, sorry. Of secondary effects provided that they are somehow linked to the no-tab movement, which has been guarding the territory of the Susa Valley for over 20 years and firmly opposed to the construction of the high-speed train. In the context of this conflict, there have been some episodes of open struggle between protesters and police, which led to convictions of members of the movement for resistance and damage crimes. The most interesting aspect, however, is the appeal by the investigators to the category of terrorism through the elevation of certain sabotage conducts to the offences of attack for terrorist aims and of act of terrorism with deadly or explosive devices under Articles 208 and 208 bis of the Criminal Code, which was ultimately rolled out by the Cassazione. In this context, it does not seem out of place to note how the accusatory attitude has been attempting to censure some positions which have become emblematic rather because of the inclination that for the statement themselves. Giving rise to sensational trials in which judicial attention focused on weighing up the exact support that the opinions expressed would have ensured to certain violent acts. The most famous investigation is undoubtedly the one that led to the indictment for incitement to crime of the writer and journalist Harry De Luca, after he said in an interview that the TAV must be sabotaged. But over the years, other accusations followed, and to stay at the incrimination of words, a certain sensation was caused by the 2 months prison sentence for moral complicity in aggravated violence and occupation of land imposed on the student Roberta Chiroli, who had closely followed the protest in Valsusa, making a degree thesis in anthropology for the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. The student, later acquitted on appeal, was considered psychologically involved in the violent facts due to the use in her thesis of the narrative device of the first-person narration. In a non-dissimilar way, albeit in a completely different context, democratic Spain has been the subject of a widespread international criticism due to the harsher repression with which the central state responded to the demands for independence coming from Catalonia, culminated in the unilateral holding of the referendum on independence on 1st October 2017. Also in this occasion, we can recognize by the Tribunal Supremo of Madrid the use of particularly serious criminal offenses to incriminate the actions of the main political leaders, who were held responsible for instigating behaviors and were initially prosecuted for rebellion, a crime for which the criminal code provides for a sentence ranging from 15 to 25 years in prison, requiring, however, that the revolt promote be implemented violenta y públicamente. The blatant lack of the requirement of violence has been widely stigmatized by the scholars, and also on it were founded, moreover, the rejections of European arrest warrants for separatist leaders fled abroad, issued by German and Belgian judicial authorities. However, there are several other indications of a conception of criminal law as an instrument for skimming off unpleasant opinions. In recent years, in fact, trials and sentences have followed against young rappers, considered responsible with their lyrics for inciting terrorism and violence, as well as crown offenses. Valtonyc and Pablo Hasél must both serve years in prison for some phrases contained in the lyrics of their songs. While the second is currently in prison, the first took refuge in Belgium, where the judicial authorities have rejected the European arrest warrant issued by Madrid, considering that the facts alleged against the Spanish artist do not constitute offense under Belgian law, and that in any case, does not match the definition of terrorism of the European arrest warrant law. Then there is the interesting judicial case of Cassandra Verapaz, reported in 2016 for a series of jokes published on Twitter, then satirized the peculiar modalities of the terrorist attack with which the ETA in 1973 eliminated Luis Carrero Blanco, president of the Gobierno, in the final phase of the Franco dictatorship. The amount of explosive positioned below the roadway where the presidential car passed was such that the car was literally blown up, going over a 4-story building, and some of the mockery of the regime relayed by the girl via her social account, which ironize on Franco's successor, portraying him as an astronaut. The girl was sentenced in the first instance by the Audiencia Nacional to 1 year of imprisonment for apology of terrorism and the humiliation of the victims, but the sentence was subsequently overturned by the Tribunal Supremo. On the other hand, it should be reported that this is not an isolated case, and the other social network users fared worse. In the context of the Operación Araña, an investigation carried out by the Guardia Civil between 2014 and 2016, with the main aim of prosecuting the apology of terrorism in social networks, were recorded 77 arrests and over 40 sentences with penalties up to 2 years of imprisonment, including other cases that are very discussed that involved journalists and artists. In the end, against what looks like a repression of return, it's appropriate and indeed necessary to firmly assert the role of dissent and preserve its operating space, because it is the best antidote against any form of authoritarianism, whether explicit or not. Therefore, it's necessary a decisive attention to incrimination for crimes of opinion, especially if this appears to be part of a total design of the legitimation of minority ideas and positions. It's perhaps time to ask ourselves whether libre condendo, certain criminal offenses designed by outdated regimes, can finally be eliminated from the criminal code, which no longer seem adequate and proportionate to the proper protection of the legal goods that these are intended to protect, but which, on the contrary, lend themselves to exactly these repressive abuses for which they were codified many decades ago. Thank you.
And now we have the Federico Spagnoli. Federico Spagnoli is online.
I saw him, so
Yes.
here it is.
Yes, perfect. Federico Spagnoli dedicated his paper to the Spanish case, so we can continue the research presented by Salvadori. Federico, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And I have some questions for you.
All right. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
All right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this occasion. In my paper, I will try to show how constitutional degradation took place in Spain in the last decade because of the political struggle regarding Catalonia's secession attempts. And I will compare this case with the 2014 Scottish independence referendum to explain why the outcome was different and how this Scottish model could represent a solution to the Spanish crisis. First, I will hint at the problematic nature of secession under the Spanish Constitution and at the causes of Catalan secessionism. Second, I will remember how the secessionists tried to hold many unilateral independence referenda and how Spain reacted by repeatedly appealing to the Tribunal Constitucional. Third, I will argue that the actions of both sides had a negative impact on the constitutional balance and led to constitutional degradation. I will then compare and contrast the reactions with the political agreement which made the Scottish independence referendum possible and legal. However, I will also point out the peculiarities that make it difficult to implement such a process in Spain, and I will conclude by proposing a possible solution to this impasse, even though the current political situation makes it quite unlikely. So, Article 2 of the Spanish Constitution of 1978, while providing for the autonomy of regions and nationalities, affirms the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation. That is, it seems to explicitly forbid secession. However, as Catalonia's attempts to gain greater autonomy failed when the Statute of Autonomy of 2006 was partly declared unconstitutional 4 years later, and the Spanish government rejected any political compromise, many people in Catalonia began to feel dissatisfied with the constitution and to call for secession. Ever since 2012, proponents of Catalan independence have been invoked the so-called derecho a decidir, that is, the alleged right of the Catalan people to decide about Catalonia's constitutional status through a democratic vote. The Catalan parliament has adopted several resolutions aiming to regulate this right exercise. However, the Spanish government consistently reacted by refusing to negotiate and resorting to the Tribunal Constitucional, Spain's constitutional court. At first, the tribunal tried to mediate between the contestants. In Judgment 42 of 2014, it stated that a secession referendum could be held under a constitutional amendment and that the Spanish parliament would be constitutionally obliged to consider such an amendment proposal by Catalonia. However, Spain again refused its assent. Then the Catalan authorities opted for unilateral action. First, they tried to hold popular consultations without legal value. Then they declared the beginning of a political process which would bring about an independent Republic of Catalonia and expressly rejected the authority of the Tribunal Constitucional. Finally, two laws were approved, providing for a unilateral independence referendum to be held on the 1st October 2017. All these acts were impugned by the government and declared unconstitutional by the Tribunal. 2017 referendum, as it's well known, saw violent clashes as law enforcement intervened to stop it, and its result in favor of secession was not legally recognized. And a parliamentary declaration of independence had no practical effect, and the state proceeded to temporarily suspend Catalonia's autonomy. Even though Prime Minister Rajoy, strongly opposed to compromise with Catalan nationalists, has since been replaced by Pedro Sánchez, more willing to negotiate, the Catalan problem is still very far from being resolved. As I've just tried to show, both actors of the crisis arguably committed violations which led to constitutional degradation. On the one hand, the Catalan secessionists ignored the Spanish constitution and tried to push an unauthorized referendum for independence. On the other hand, the Spanish government refused to recognize Catalonia's aspirations for autonomy and resorted to repressive measures. And above all, its constant use of constitutional justice as an alternative to negotiation led to a dangerous judicialization of politics and ended up ruining the political legitimacy of the Tribunal Constitucional and of the Constitution itself. Actually, the Tribunal had already been criticized for its decision on the Statute of Catalonia in 2010, widely considered as a politically unwise judgment which led to a severe increase in support for independence. Although later Judgment 42 of 2014 tried to frame the secession demand in a constitutional way, its suggestion failed for a lack of the political consent required for constitutional revision. Later, the Tribunal was called to adjudicate several conflicts between the state and Catalonia, despite its lack of impartiality, as its members are all politically appointed with very little involvement of the autonomous communities, and this especially after the 2015 reform. The tribunal thus came to be perceived by the independentists as in favor of the state and devoid of legitimacy to decide on the matter. Furthermore, there is no other satisfying institutional framework for addressing regional problems in Spain. The constitution itself is seen by secessionists as a broken agreement between Catalonia and Spain, and therefore they consider it no longer binding. However, a potential alternative to conflict could be represented by the contemporary Scottish case, which has been lauded as a role model for secession in Western countries. After the Scottish National Party claimed an electoral mandate to lead the country to independence in 2011, the British government did not appeal to the judiciary, but it chose to negotiate, and the result was the Edinburgh Agreement of 2012, which provided for a legal basis for Scotland to hold the referendum, which, as we all know, took place on 18 September 2014. So the different attitude of the British government from the Spanish one was mainly due to political and constitutional reasons. On the one hand, it gave much importance to the SNP democratic mandate, and on the other, the uncodified nature of the British Constitution allowed for an ad hoc political solution to be adopted. However, this model cannot readily be transposed to Spain because Spain has a written constitution which can only be amended by specific procedures, and moreover, it requires the consent of both parties to work. So, to conclude, I've tried to argue that Catalonia's secession attempts and the reaction by the Spanish government caused a process of constitutional degradation by weakening the authority of the Constitution and the legitimacy of the Constitutional Court. The secessionists rejected the Constitution, and on the other hand, the government turned constitutional legality into a matter of contention rather than an instrument of conflict resolution, and both eclipsed the role of parliaments as political actors. The Scottish model, as I said, is based on the cooperation between government, and it cannot readily be applied to Spain. But there could be a way out of the constitutional impasse, as already suggested by the Tribunal Constitucional in 2014. The Tribunal held that secession can be attained under the Constitution provided that constitutional revision is employed. So it tried to balance between constitutional legality and democratic legitimacy by adopting at least the spirit of the Scottish precedent and of the famed secession reference of the Supreme Court of Canada as well. Thus, the representative of Catalonia and Spain will finally be able to engage in democratic negotiations on the subject. But this requires a great degree of political consent between parties, especially if the complex Article 161 revision procedure is to be followed. And this does not seem to be the case with Spain, as the issue of Catalan independence remains very much controversial. Therefore, at least for the present, it is very difficult to imagine a political solution to this thorny question. I am done, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Federico, for this comparison between the Spanish case and the Scottish case, and when you say the political use of constitutional justice as an alternative to negotiation is a sort of constitutional degradation. So, very interesting. And the last but not least, as Americans say, is the paper of Emese Trilagi. I apologize for the pronunciation of your surname.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Fine, perfect, thank you. So I can move and stay to teach in Hungary if I can say your surname in a correct way. Thank you very much. And the last paper is related to the Hungarian case that probably is one of the most interesting cases in the European context. So, Emese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to maybe share my screen with you, or if not, well, I prepared the PowerPoint, but I can send it later. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about is the chances of pluralistic political competition in populist Hungary. However, since I submitted my abstract to this conference, the coronavirus pandemic has happened. So I decided to include those new governmental measures as well, which are in relation with the pandemic and may affect the pluralism in Hungary. Well, if we want to talk about this question, there could be two approaches. One could be to examine the transformation of the whole electoral system of Hungary after 2010. No, I will not go into details about why I'm talking about what happened after 2010, because in the previous presentations, especially in Fernando's, that was very well explained. And the other approach could be to examine the partial transformation of the system of party and campaign financing in Hungary. And this is a bit less popular approach, and there are less papers about this issue. So this is why I'm focusing on this question right now. As you all very well know, the party and campaign financing system strongly affects the capability of the political parties to participate in the elections, to manage themselves, to manage their own operations. Since my paper is very long, I will try to be very concise here and just focus on a few most important points. So first of all, I will give you a summary of the legal framework of the party and campaign financing in Hungary. Secondly, I will focus on the revenue system of political parties, which has changed in the last decade, and there was a major change in 2020, and the justification for that was the pandemic. So this I will elaborate in more detail. And lastly, I'll give you an overview of these governmental measures from 2020 and also the results of those questionnaires which I sent to the representatives of the political parties and asked them how they feel about these changes and how they can still manage the existence of their parties. So we have a very much fragmented legal system or legal framework here in this regard. First of all, we have a so-called Party Act, which dates back to 1989, but it has been modified since then more than 22 times. So it means that it is already very much fragmented, and in some cases, it is even very hard to understand what this act actually wants to say. Secondly, we have a new act on the transparency of campaign costs. It is from 2013. In short, it's called the Campaign Finance Act. This one will play an important role in this presentation. And we have some other acts which regulate this issue, like the Act on Electoral Procedure, the Party Foundation Act, always the Annual State Budget Act, which allocates the annual financing of the political parties, but also we should mention the State Property Act, the Act on Associations, and so forth. So the conclusion is that we have a very highly fragmented legal framework, which makes it difficult to understand the whole system. Secondly, in this issue, the most important aspect is to elaborate on the incomes of the political parties. The Party Act stipulates that the income of a political party may consist of membership fees, subsidies from state budget, real estate transferred by the state, and contributions from private individuals with Hungarian citizenship. This modification comes from 2013. It came into effect in 2014, and I'll come back to this issue just a bit later. There are also other possible sources, but these are the most important ones, which play a real role in the revenue system of the parties. And among all those, the most important is the state subsidies. The Act says that the specific amount of subsidies allocated annually from the state budget for the regular operation of parties, the exact sum is determined by the Annual Budget Act, with the allocation rules spelled out in the Party Act. 25% of the amount that may be allotted to parties in equal percentage to the parties that have obtained parliamentary mandates on the last general elections, and the remaining 75% shall be distributed between the parties in proportion to the number of votes cast for them or to their candidates on the general elections. Parties which do not obtain at least 1% of the votes are not eligible to receive budgetary subsidies. The other important income is the private contributions. Parties can accept donations from private persons, but only from those who are Hungarian citizens. This modification from 2013-14 aimed to prevent non-transparent influences over the political parties. However, this prohibition of accepting donations from non-Hungarian private individuals proves to be controversial in practice. On one hand, non-Hungarian citizens can participate in the EP and municipal elections under certain circumstances, and because of this, it is questionable whether their right to demonstrate financial support to their favored political parties should be strictly limited or not. This prohibition may be considered as an infringement on the freedom of expression. On the other hand, the political parties do not have sufficient tools to control the citizenship of their donors, thus the regulation and the threat of possible fines keeps the parties back from launching excessive fundraising campaigns and makes them very much dependent on state subsidies in the end. If we have a look at the revenue structure of the parties, we can also see that the state funding is the most important income to them. They are very much dependent on this. The second most important is the private contributions, and that the membership fees do not play an important role in this regard. However, some of the newcomer political parties, such as Momentum and Democratic Coalition, they rely on contributions and membership fees more than the others. And the reason for that, on one hand, is that they were forced to launch fundraising campaigns because they did not have access to state funding. And on the other hand, since they are newcomers, they have, in some cases, very different approaches to manage themselves than the well-established old political parties. Still, the examination of the legal framework and these annual reports show that the regulations push the parties towards the state subsidies and favor the more established players of the political marketplace. It also can be said that the state subsidies provided based on a reasoned criteria, such as the result of the general elections. However, there are opinions that these criteria should be expanded to take into account the results of the EP elections and the municipal elections, thus promoting a more fair distribution of state subsidies and more equality among the players. And this was the case, or this was the landscape when the coronavirus pandemic hit and the government announced measures regarding the pandemic and regarding the financing of political parties. In last April, the government issued a decree on the pandemic defense funding. And with this decree, they redirected 50% of the yearly public funding of political parties to a new pandemic fund. So it meant that while the year was going on, sometime in April, the political parties got the news that 50% of their state funding will be taken away from them. And the announcement of these measures came from the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, personally. Also, the deputy chair of Fidesz parliamentary group commented on Facebook that this is the right decision, and I hope that all parties agree to share this burden. Defense against the pandemic is now the most important thing. So, because of this approach, the parties, most of them remained silent about this issue. They did not dare to criticize it. However, moderate reactions arrived from some civil society organizations. They stated that the amount of money is like a drop in the ocean considering the economic costs of the pandemic. But on the other hand, the society is losing a lot by halving the public funds of the parties. And after this rearrangement of funds of parliamentary factions happened to compensate for this 50% cut, actually, in May, an amendment to the Party Act made it possible for the parliamentary factions to redirect their funds to the political parties. However, it's highly problematic because the financial support provided by the parliamentary groups will not be included in the annual reports of the political parties, meaning that the data regarding their financial management might become more fragmented. Also, part of it will be found in the reports, while some substantial information might be available only via public data request filed to the Office of National Assembly. And it's also questionable whether you will get real responses to these requests. This all happened just a bit more than 1 year before the next parliamentary elections. So I decided to ask the political parties how it affects them. I sent them questionnaires consisting of 10 questions regarding the replacement of the lost funds, the austerity measures which they were forced to take, the impact of the pandemic on their everyday political activities, and from those parties which are eligible for state funding, only 5 parties proved to be responsive, and it's very unfortunate that the governing parties, the Fidesz and the Christian Democrats, did not give any response. Still, from the responses of these 5 parties, some conclusions may be drawn. So regarding the replacement of the lost incomes, newer parties, the already mentioned Momentum and Democratic Coalition, stated that they will try to launch widespread fundraising campaigns. However, all of the political parties pointed out that their donors are also facing financial difficulties, so they do not expect it to be very successful. On the other hand, all the political parties, the well-established ones, stated that they would still rely on the public funds, especially on those which arrive from the management funds of the parliamentary groups. And even some of the other political parties stated that they will try to sell their real estates or terminate their long-term contracts or giving up planned investments or rents. They will cancel trainings which aim to have the preparation for the parliamentary elections. They will dismiss the permanent staff, and so on and so forth. So in general, it can be stated that this very sudden change in 2020 affected the political parties very strongly, and it may have a very profound effect on the political campaign, which is about to start right now before the next general elections. As for the impact on everyday political activity, all of the political parties stated that they can use the online presence, and it did not cause a problem to them during the pandemic. However, building and also maintaining contact with the political base turned out to be very tricky, and it again hits hard the newcomer political parties who do not have such a close and strong political base as the well-established ones. So as for the conclusions, because I can see that the time is flying, it can be concluded that these changes related to the coronavirus pandemic further aggravated the already existing systemic problems of the legal framework. They decreased the transparency by simultaneously weakened the guarantees of the equal treatment of political parties. And rules on the allocation of state subsidies already favor the well-established political forces, by the lack of incentives on private contributions and requirements, which discourage the parties to launch wide-scale fundraising campaigns in order to foster the participation of the citizens. However, they tend to protect the stability of the party system. They also make it difficult for new and small parties to participate in the political competition with equal chances. And just one note, which I elaborate more in the paper, all these issues could be addressed by the international organizations such as Venice Commission and so on. But the issue here, as in many other cases with the Hungarian legal system, is that on the surface, it seems that the governmental measures follow some of the rules and recommendations of these international organizations. However, these tend to be very selective, and in the end, the strange animal which they compose with this selective methodology will show us a very different framework and landscape than what we would like to see. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to you. This was the last paper. It was very interesting, I think, for all of us to this paper. We spoke about Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, Benin, Brazil, Albania, Spain, Italy. These are very different countries that could not be compared. But the subject of constitutional degradation makes it possible to compare these countries. And we can identify, in my opinion, some common and recurring elements. First of all, who are the protagonists of this constitutional degradation? It's clear in your presentation, governments. And the behaviors of governments are the same in all of these countries. They try to increase their power over parliament and the judiciary. And in some cases, judiciary power tries to be a barrier to the constitutional degradation. Sometimes judiciary follow the government and the constitution. Secondly, targets. What are the targets of constitution? In my opinion, and according to the paper presented today, victims are social, civil, and cultural rights, or the unity of the state. In the Brazilian case, problematic in this case, but also the Spanish-Polish case, the Spanish presented before. Third, the instrument of constitutional debate. We can find two different legal instruments. First of all, constitutional amendments approved by the parliament or with a referendum, so following constitutional rules. And secondly, administrative acts. Also legal amnesty. At the end, why these arguments, which are the causes of the constitutional degradation? Well, according to the paper presented, I think that we can find several causes. Populism in all of this country, poverty, real or imagined. In some cases, there is the fear of poverty that creates the condition for constitutional degradation. Sovereignty, or we can call sovralocalism in case of secessionist movement, like in Scotland, Spain, and probably in Italy until 10 years ago. Well, if this is the situation, and if we can compare with this subject several different countries, I would like to ask my colleagues, what can be the remedies of this situation, if there are? What, in your opinion, is possible to do for come back the previous situation, if it's possible? And the judiciary can be a barrier to the constitutional degradation or not. For example, in Hungary, is it possible after the changement of the government, or we lost also this? So this is my question, very generic to all of our scholars. I don't know if there are any questions by audience, first of all in presence, and secondly online. And I don't know if one or more of our scholars want to take the floor, break the ice, and try to answer. Yes, Professor Grofi wants to. Probably it's better if you come here. I know, we have a mic.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
But welcome is here. Yeah.
Yes, in this way, audience can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pierluigi. Much Professor Petrillo, I should say. And thank you very much to all the panelists. Actually, it is a bit bizarre, probably. But my question, I had a question when I saw there, listening to the presentation. I had a question to all the panelists. And it was exactly the same question Professor Petrillo raised. Exactly the same about ranks. Because I had the same feeling as Professor Petrillo. All of you described very well what is going on, the processes. And some of you also discussed the causes, reasons of what is happening. But only few know it. Trying to introduce this issue of the ranks. What can we do? Institutional level, which institutions, which rules at domestic or international level, or if there are other actions that are probably broader than just institutional elements, something probably much more related to society, to education, or to equality. I don't know, and I don't like to suggest. But yes, I have the same question. Then I think the floor just to underline that we fully coincide, and thank you all of you for your participation. I'm looking forward to listen to your answers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tanya. This is the demonstration that who was member of these doctoral programs and have the opportunity to have the same professor, probably have the same thing, I don't know. But this is the point, because your analysis was very, very interesting, very good. But was a sort of cold analysis of the situation. Now we ask for the hot version of your paper. So, what can be the remedies for you? Who can want to take the floor and try to give a first answer? It's not an examination, but we have our, I think that after the floor, Andrea Cristina, please.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. My answer is short. Sorry, I listen an echo. About my topic, there exists a global answer focused on the soft law, or make that these big three agencies adopt in their conduct code all these ethics principles ruled by the International Organization of Securities Commission, and it exists like a political pressure to that these agencies, these private, introduce in this code, internal codes, all these ethics principles about accountability and transparency in the methodologies that they follow to make the rankings and the outlook of these grades. So to me, focus just on this topic exists a global answer for relating to make the soft law more a little more hard law, if you would like to say something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, there is also a message.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to just highlight two ideas or two comments regarding this question. We have a research project which you may have heard about. It's called Demos. It's a Horizon 2020 project. And in that, we are trying to focus on those best practices which may help to stop the populist tendencies. And soon we will publish something about that. But our preliminary conclusion is that many of those approaches which we think that may help to stop populism can be rather two-sided. On one hand, I will just use this one example, the activist approach of constitutional courts. So in some cases, this activist approach may really help to stop the populist tendencies of political parties or governing political parties, but among different circumstances. For example, if a court packing has already happened, as it already did happen in Hungary, the activist approach of a constitutional court may even further strengthen the populist approach of the governing party. So this is one thing. The other is, which is an example from my paper, it also refers to international soft law and the role of international organizations which they may play. I try to refer to this that in some cases, for example, the Hungarian government uses the recommendations of international organizations to justify their moves. However, their methodology is rather selective. They use only those parts and bits from the international recommendations which can serve the government's purposes. For example, we have this Party Act from 1989, and most of the recommendations of Greco say that the most important problem with this is that it requires a two-thirds majority for modification. However, the data shows that it has been modified 22 or 23 times already, and that there is always a two-thirds majority to modify this act if it's really necessary or needed. So from this, I can also see that the international organizations, when they write their recommendations, their guidelines, they should actually consider the actual circumstances and the political reality of the country which they are talking about. So it's not enough to approach these issues from an abstract perspective, but they have to take into consideration that, for example, in that country where they say that two-thirds majority is a burden and it cannot be achieved, and because of this we cannot fight corruption and we cannot fight for transparency in Hungary, it's actually not true because the governing parties have a two-thirds majority for more than a decade. So a bit more sophisticated approach would be also necessary to make these recommendations really effective, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emese. Valentina.
Yes. Well, maybe I wouldn't like to talk for all of my colleagues, so maybe we avoid to talk about remedies because it's the most difficult parties. I mean, we don't really know which are the remedies. The problem is that we see that when the executive power normally starts to gain power over the main monitoring bodies and they start to change the constitution, it all happens while keeping a formal legalness. So the problem is how, because yes, we have the constitutional court, but we saw in many experiences that it was, I wouldn't say useless, but in the end, it was not so difficult to capture the constitutional court as well as the other accountability institutions. I think that as you were both suggesting, you and Professor Graf, it depends a lot on the context in the sense that the effectiveness of democracy needs, in order to be implemented, it needs to be shared by the citizens. So, for example, I talked about Africa, and it's clear that it is such a peculiar context in which the democratic tradition is not so rooted. So maybe it would be easier to change the democratic rules, but maybe we should focus on the accountability in front of citizenship. Maybe it's not a coincidence that also the European Union in its last mechanisms for the rule of law decided to monitoring each year this rule of law by producing reports highlighting the main problems and sharing it through the society, among the society. So maybe, I don't know, it's not a solution, but maybe we should focus on this because, I mean, sometimes we have the impression that when we talk about this phenomenon, we do not take into account the fact that there is a certain popular support for these parties and for these majorities. It is true that the majorities are exaggerated through mechanisms, but we cannot ignore that there is a support. Then we can discuss about how, why, in which way it is exaggerated, but there is. So maybe we should also question ourselves about why and the way in which democracy, the rule of law, and all the democratic guarantees are conceived among the society.
Thank you, Valentina. Can we say that in a democratic context, at least the election can be the unique instrument for contrasting constitutional degradation and try to rebuild a different constitutional situation? I don't know, but try to see what happened in USC when Trump was elected. 4 years probably are too less for create constitutional degradation, but I'm not sure. Probably are too much. But after Trump, with the new man of the government, totally the situation changed. And probably, I really hope in Brazil it will be the same if Bolsonaro will not be elected again next year, at the end of this year, I think. This man changed for 4 years, at least, the situation. And what remains after this man? We can see another situation, the Israeli situation. We noted several situations of constitutional degradation in Israel, in my opinion, in the last 5 to 6 years. And now the situation will change because change the man at the government. So the problem are single men or the culture that this kind of man represent. I don't know, but it is another question for you. If someone wants to reply. Other colleagues that want to take the floor? Are there? No? Yes.
Maybe.
Ferdinand.
Yes. Yeah, I see your point. See, the problem of culture is certainly one of the most important because, as I said before, I think that the spread of populist idea, but also of their own idea of democracy, could challenge the idea of the whole society about our institutions. Because if this idea is shared by the people, it's more difficult to make them change their mind. So I think that the cultural point is important. Also in the US, you said before, there were 4 years of Donald Trump that significantly changed the society. At the election, we had a very divided society where the last vote was important to decide who would have be the president of the US. And the same thing is in Israel, as you said before. But I think that also in Italy and in Europe, this reductive idea of democracy is well spread. And if we don't tackle this point, so if we don't tackle the cultural point, it's difficult to face and to face populist phenomenon. And I think that if we don't face this phenomenon, we cannot solve the degradation, the constitutional degradation. At least this is my point.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something?
Yes, certainly. Andrea Cristina.
I would like to say a controversial idea, because I think that talk about a remedy is to agree that that it exists a problem, and maybe it is a fallacy, because we think about it because we think that democracy is the only way, but it is not clear at all. For example, in Singapore, if we look just the economics ranking, Singapore has the maximum, the best grade. So for the economic world, Singapore is top. So if we talk about remedy, it's like say the way that the people or the government from Singapore shows is a wrong way. But maybe it's not wrong. Maybe they don't want to remedy anything, just chose another way, a different way, different from the democracy.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Well, at 6 o'clock are the end of this session. I really thank you for each paper. It was a very interesting and productive discussion for me, and every single paper was well structured and argued. And it was a pleasure for me to moderate this panel. Thank you very much, Tanya, for inviting me. And I will report back tomorrow on the common reflection of this panel. So thank you very much, Lydia, Tiago, Valentina, Ali, Elis, Ferdinando, Andrea Cristina, Giacomo Federico De Mese for joining us this debate. And I hope that you can work on your paper and try to publish it, because in my opinion, you wrote very useful reflection on this topic. So thank you very much, and we will see you tomorrow for the plenary session. Thank you. Good.